Up to now, I have thought Tony Curtis is the worst actor that ever was on the screen.
For decades, Tony Curtis stood as one of Hollywood's cleanest symbols, charming, handsome, and almost untouchable. The kind of star audiences trusted without question. But away from the screen, his life was tangled with addiction, depression, and relationships that never seemed to last. 6 marriages, endless affairs, a private chaos few wanted to examine too closely. And yet, none of that prepared anyone for what surfaced years after his death. An allegation by Kim Novak. One so disturbing it forces a complete rethinking of who Tony Curtis really was. The rise of Tony Curtis. For much of the 1950s, Tony Curtis was Hollywood's perfect leading man. He had the face, the confidence, the voice, and a screen presence that made him feel accessible and untouchable at the same time. The audience saw charm. Studios saw profit. Magazines saw a heartthrob built for the spotlight. But the image was never the whole story. Behind the polished roles and carefully managed publicity, Curtis carried a personal history that was unstable, painful, and unresolved. And long after his death, that private side would resurface again. This time through fellow Hollywood star Kim Novak, who would make an accusation so shocking, it changed how many people began to look back on his legacy. Tony Curtis was born Bernard Schwartz on June 3, 1925 in Manhattan, New York City. He was the eldest of 3 children born to Emanuel Schwartz and Helen Klein, Jewish immigrants whose lives were shaped by economic hardship. The family eventually settled in the Bronx, where money was scarce and daily life was unpredictable. Curtis grew up in an apartment where his parents spoke Hungarian and Yiddish almost exclusively. As a child, he reportedly struggled to communicate outside the home, often feeling isolated and behind his peers. His home life was not stable. Curtis later spoke openly about his mother's emotional volatility, describing an environment marked by frequent tension and fear. Discipline could be harsh. Affection was inconsistent. Home, for Curtis, was not a place of safety or reassurance. It was something to endure. At the age of 12, Curtis experienced a loss that would follow him for the rest of his life. His younger brother Julius tragically passed after being struck by a truck. The accident was sudden, violent, and devastating. Curtis never fully recovered from it. Friends and family later noted that the death left a visible mark on him, one that resurfaced repeatedly in his adult life. Years later, tragedy struck again when another brother, Robert, died. The compounded losses reinforced a pattern that defined Curtis's early years. Instability followed by grief, with little space to process either. His formal education suffered as a result. He attended school irregularly and never viewed academics as a path forward. Curtis later described himself as learning life the hard way, without guidance or protection. In 1943, he enlisted in the United States Navy during World War II. He served as a signalman 3rd class aboard the submarine tender USS Proteus. In 1945, Curtis was present in Tokyo Bay during Japan's formal surrender. The experience was historic, but it was also deeply unsettling. Like many servicemen, he returned home with memories that didn't fade easily. Adjusting to civilian life proved difficult. The discipline of the military gave way to emotional restlessness and unresolved stress. After the war, Curtis searched for direction. He enrolled at the New School for Social Research to study acting, drawn to performance as a way forward. By the late 1940s, he moved to Hollywood. Universal Pictures signed him, but there was one condition. He had to change his name from Bernard Schwartz to Tony Curtis. The name change worked. Early roles were small, including a brief appearance in Criss Cross in 1949, but his looks made him impossible to ignore. Studios promoted him aggressively. By the early 1950s, Curtis had become a fixture in theaters and fan magazines. He was marketed as charming, witty, and irresistibly confident. Off-screen, his social life became part of the brand. What surprised many critics was that Curtis didn't stay confined to lightweight roles. In Sweet Smell of Success, he delivered a sharp, unsettling performance that showed real depth. In The Defiant Ones, he starred alongside Sidney Poitier, and earned an Academy Award nomination, proving he could carry serious material. Over 6 decades, Curtis appeared in more than 100 films and later transitioned successfully into television, including a starring role in The Persuaders during the 1970s. To the public, it looked like a flawless ascent, but the pressure, the expectations, and the unresolved pain from his early life never disappeared. They followed him quietly into fame, into relationships, and eventually into controversies that would only become clearer years later. The shadows behind the fame. By the time Tony Curtis became a household name, Hollywood had already decided how it wanted to use him. The studio system of the 1950s was efficient, rigid, and unforgiving. If an actor made money in one lane, that's where they were expected to stay. For Curtis, that lane was clear almost immediately. He was handsome, charming, romantic, and safe. The problem was that Curtis didn't see himself that way. Despite his growing popularity, he grew increasingly frustrated with being treated as little more than a pretty face. Studio executives leaned heavily on his looks, casting him repeatedly in roles designed to attract young audiences rather than challenge him as an actor. Curtis wanted range, he wanted complexity, he wanted to be taken seriously. But early on, Hollywood had little interest in letting him step outside the image it had built for him. Maintaining that image came with its own pressures. As a matinee idol, Curtis was expected to look perfect, sound confident, and project ease at all times. Public appearances, interviews, and film promotions all reinforced the same persona. There was little room for vulnerability or contradiction. Behind the scenes, that constant performance created a disconnect between who he was and who he was expected to be. As the years went on, that disconnect hardened into resentment. Curtis became openly disenchanted with the industry that had elevated him but refused to trust his abilities beyond his appearance. Even after proving himself in demanding roles, he sensed that Hollywood still viewed him through the same narrow lens. That feeling of being underestimated and boxed in followed him for decades. At the same time, Curtis was dealing with mental health struggles that rarely surfaced in public. He battled depression for much of his life, including during periods when his career appeared strongest. Success did not bring peace. If anything, it intensified the pressure. The contrast between public admiration and private dissatisfaction became difficult to manage. To cope, Curtis turned to alcohol and illicit substances. His addiction became a recurring problem, particularly during the height of his fame. Substance use offered temporary relief from anxiety and emotional pain, but it came at a cost. His behavior became unpredictable. Relationships suffered, and professionally, his reliability began to falter. Studios noticed, directors hesitated, and roles became less consistent. While Curtis continued working, the momentum he once had slowed. Some opportunities disappeared entirely. The industry that had once protected him no longer felt obligated to do so. Still, Curtis did not simply give up. Over the years, he made multiple attempts to confront his addictions. Recovery was not a straight path, but there was persistence in his efforts. He accepted roles in television and independent projects, adapting to an industry that was changing and less willing to revolve around stars. Then, in 1994, Curtis suffered a loss that cut deeper than any professional setback. His son, Nicholas Curtis, died from an overdose at the age of 23. For Curtis, the tragedy was overwhelming. He had struggled with addiction himself, and now he was facing its consequences in the most personal way possible. The loss devastated him. Friends noted that it forced him to confront the long-term impact of the life he had lived, not just on himself, but on those closest to him. The grief never fully lifted. Even years later, Curtis spoke of his son with visible pain. As he grew older, Curtis searched for ways to quiet the internal chaos that fame, loss, and regret had left behind. One unexpected outlet became central to his later life: painting. What began as a personal experiment developed into a serious creative pursuit. Curtis painted daily, often obsessively, using art as a way to focus his mind and release emotion without explanation or performance. His work gained recognition. Exhibitions were held internationally, and collectors took interest. Curtis spoke openly about how painting helped him manage his depression and maintain sobriety. It gave him control over something that was entirely his. In many ways, painting offered the privacy acting never fully could. By the time he entered his final years, Tony Curtis was no longer chasing the version of himself that Hollywood had created. He was quieter, more reflective, and more honest about his struggles. But even then, parts of his life remained unresolved, particularly when it came to the people he loved. And nowhere would those unresolved tensions become more visible than in his romantic relationships, because behind the fame and talent was a love life marked by intensity, instability, and consequences that followed him to the very end. Tony Curtis's chaotic love life. As Tony Curtis's career surged through the 1950s and into the next decade, his personal life became just as public as his films. Romance was not a private matter for movie stars of his era. It was currency. Studios encouraged it, magazines amplified it, and audiences consumed it eagerly. Curtis understood that system well, and at times used it to his advantage. But the emotional cost of that visibility would follow him for decades. His first marriage placed him at the center of Hollywood royalty. Curtis married Janet Leigh on June 4, 1951, in Greenwich, Connecticut. At the time, Leigh was already an established actress, later immortalized by her role in Psycho. Together, they became one of the most photographed couples in the industry. They were both attractive, successful, and seemingly aligned in ambition. However, behind the image, the marriage was complicated from the start. Curtis reportedly later admitted that his reasons for marrying Leigh were not purely romantic. While he loved her, he also needed a publicity boost at the time. The couple had two daughters, Kelly Curtis in 1956 and Jamie Lee Curtis in 1958. While Curtis was working constantly and building his reputation, Leigh often shouldered the responsibilities at home. The imbalance grew sharper as Curtis's fame increased. Infidelity became a recurring issue. Long shoots, frequent travel, and a growing sense of entitlement strained the marriage beyond repair. By 1962, the relationship collapsed under the weight of Curtis's affairs and the pressures of two demanding careers. Their divorce marked the end of a union that had once symbolized Hollywood perfection, but had long since stopped functioning privately. Not long after, Curtis entered a very different relationship. In 1963, he married Christine Kaufmann, a German actress he met while filming Taras Bulba. Kaufmann was just 18 years old at the time of their marriage. Curtis, more than twice her age, was already deeply entrenched in the habits and expectations of stardom. They had two daughters together, Alexandra, born in 1964, and Allegra, born in 1966. Curtis later described Kaufmann as beautiful and innocent, a description that underscored the imbalance between them. He also admitted that his lifestyle, marked by excess, constant attention, and infidelity, was incompatible with her desire for stability. As Kaufmann matured, she sought independence and distance from Hollywood's suffocating expectations. Curtis, meanwhile, showed little sign of changing. His affairs continued, their arguments escalated, and by 1968, the marriage ended. Kaufmann returned to Europe, determined to build a life separate from Curtis's chaos. That same year, Curtis married again. His third wife was Leslie Allen, an actress and dancer. They married in 1968, during a period when Curtis's career was beginning to lose momentum. Unlike his previous marriages, this one unfolded largely outside the glare of constant media fascination, but the internal pressures were no less intense. They had two sons, Nicholas, born in 1970, and Benjamin, born in 1973. By this point, Curtis's struggles with substance abuse were becoming harder to hide. Addiction strained his reliability, his finances, and his ability to be present at home. Career decline added another layer of tension, as the certainty and power he once enjoyed in Hollywood began to fade. The marriage lasted longer than his previous two, but the underlying issues were never resolved. By 1982, Curtis and Allen divorced, ending a relationship that had weathered more years but not fewer problems. In 1984, Curtis married Andrea Savio, an actress he met during a period when he was attempting to stabilize both his personal life and his career. The marriage began with optimism, but it quickly revealed familiar problems. Curtis later acknowledged that he had not been faithful and that the relationship was turbulent from the start. Arguments were frequent, trust eroded, and by 1992, the marriage ended in divorce, another chapter closing without resolution. What followed was one of the briefest marriages of his life. In 1993, Curtis married Lisa Deutsch, a lawyer far removed from the entertainment industry. The contrast, however, did little to change the outcome. The marriage lasted just 1 year. Curtis later dismissed it with dry humor, calling it a mistake from the beginning. The remark was casual, but it reflected a pattern he no longer tried to disguise. He was impulsive with commitment and quick to withdraw emotionally. Finally, in 1998, Curtis married Jill Vandenberg Curtis, a horse trainer who was 45 years younger than him. The age gap drew criticism almost immediately, both from the public and from Curtis's own family. But unlike previous relationships, this one endured. Jill remained with Curtis until his death in 2010. Curtis defended the marriage consistently. He stated that Jill brought calm and structure into his life at a time when he needed it most. Friends noted that his later years were quieter, more routine-oriented, and less chaotic than before. While controversy never disappeared, Curtis appeared more settled than he had been in decades. Still, marriage was only one part of Curtis's romantic history. Throughout his career, he was notorious for affairs with actresses, models, and socialites. Hollywood gossip columns followed his movements closely, often documenting relationships that overlapped with his marriages. One of the most talked about rumors involved Marilyn Monroe during the filming of Some Like It Hot. Curtis later fueled speculation with a remark that followed him for years. In an interview, he said, "I loved the idea of working with Marilyn in a movie. My marriage was in a bad state, and I had no idea what hers was like, but I had this insane idea that maybe something would happen between us while we were making the movie." Tony later alleged that he and Marilyn had an affair that ended with her falling in love with him. He allegedly said, "She told me she loved me and more than anything wanted to have babies with me. That made me feel awkward. My wife was expecting our second child. It wasn't a marriage I wanted to stay in, but I didn't want to get divorced at that time because I thought that was the wrong thing to do, but Marilyn wanted to divorce Arthur Miller if I divorced Janet." But the controversial flings didn't end there. Curtis was also briefly linked to Natalie Wood in the 1950s. While the relationship was short-lived, it added to a growing narrative that Curtis moved easily from one romantic connection to another, rarely staying long enough for stability to form. Other names followed. Gloria DeHaven, Mamie Van Doren, and several others appeared repeatedly in gossip columns. Some relationships were confirmed, others rumored, but together they painted a consistent picture. Curtis was rarely alone and rarely satisfied. In later interviews, Curtis acknowledged this openly. He admitted that he was addicted to the thrill of new relationships. He was always looking for love, but didn't know how to keep it. Love, for Curtis, was pursuit rather than maintenance. The excitement mattered more than the endurance. By the time Curtis reached his final years, much of the chaos had slowed, but the consequences of his choices remained visible in strained family relationships, unresolved regrets, and stories that refused to fade. And as his health declined, those consequences would become impossible to ignore, because the final chapter of Tony Curtis's life was not defined by glamour or scandal, but by loss, reflection, and a reckoning that arrived quietly after the spotlight had moved on. Tony Curtis's heartbreaking final years. By the time Tony Curtis entered his 80s, the energy and restlessness that once defined him had been replaced by physical limitation and quiet routine. The man who had spent decades moving relentlessly from film sets to relationships to reinventions was now forced to slow down, not by choice, but by failing health. Curtis had long suffered from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a progressive lung condition closely tied to his lifelong smoking habit. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Simple activities required planning and rest. Over time, the disease reshaped his daily life, reducing his independence and stamina. Alongside this disease, Curtis also faced serious heart problems. In 1994, he underwent heart bypass surgery, a major procedure that marked the beginning of a long period of medical monitoring and recovery. As the years passed, his strength declined. Curtis increasingly relied on a wheelchair, not because he wanted to, but because his breathing and mobility left him with few alternatives. Public appearances became rare and carefully managed. When he did appear, the contrast with the vibrant image people remembered from his films was unmistakable. In July 2010, just months before his death, Curtis was hospitalized after suffering breathing problems during a book signing event. The incident showed how fragile his condition had become. For those close to him, it was clear that his health was no longer stable. Curtis returned home, but his world had narrowed considerably. Curtis had 6 children from his marriages, including actress Jamie Lee Curtis. Over the years, he admitted openly that he had not been a present father. His career, his lifestyle, and his personal struggles often took priority. In interviews, he acknowledged the distance, describing himself as largely absent during their formative years. His children, in turn, spoke candidly about the strain. Relationships were described as distant and inconsistent, marked by long periods of separation. Jamie Lee Curtis later characterized her relationship with her father as complicated, a careful word that carried both respect and unresolved pain. She acknowledged admiration for his talent, but did not shy away from the emotional cost of growing up without stability. As Curtis's health declined, the emotional distance between him and his children did not close. It solidified. Years passed with limited contact. Holidays came and went quietly. There were no dramatic confrontations, just prolonged absence. For Curtis, reconciliation seemed to remain an abstract idea rather than an active pursuit. For his children, time hardened disappointment into acceptance. And just when many expected some form of reconciliation, another scandal deepened the divide. Shortly before his death, Curtis revised his will. In a move that stunned both Hollywood and his own family, he disinherited all 6 of his children. His estimated $60 million estate was left entirely to his 6th wife, Jill Vandenberg Curtis. The decision shocked everyone. When news of the will became public after his death, the reaction was immediate and intense. Industry observers were stunned not just by the financial implications, but by the finality of the choice. Disinheritance is rare at that level of wealth, and rarer still when it involves all children equally. Curtis made his intent unmistakably clear in the legal documents, stating that he was very specific in his wishes and had intentionally excluded his children. There was no ambiguity, no compromise. For his family, the choice felt final in a way that went beyond finances. It signaled emotional closure without resolution. The decision to revise his will did not happen in isolation. By the late 2000s, Curtis was increasingly dependent on those around him for daily care and structure. Jill Vandenberg Curtis managed much of his routine, his household, and his public appearances. Friends described Curtis as more inward-looking during this period, less interested in repairing old relationships than in preserving the stability he felt he had finally found. His children contested the will, hoping to challenge its validity or intent, but the effort failed. The courts upheld Curtis's final wishes. Jill inherited the estate in full. 3 years after Curtis's death, she remarried, choosing a quieter life far removed from Hollywood. On September 29, 2010, Tony Curtis died at the age of 85 in Henderson, Nevada. The official cause was cardiopulmonary arrest, with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and heart disease listed as contributing factors. His death was not sudden, but it was definitive. The long decline had ended. A funeral was held in Las Vegas, attended by family members, friends, and figures from the entertainment industry. The gathering reflected the contradictions of his life. celebration, and distance existing side by side. He was remembered publicly as a Hollywood icon whose career spanned more than 6 decades, a performer who helped define an era of American cinema. Privately, the emotions were more complex. Curtis left behind an extraordinary body of work, but also a legacy shaped by estrangement, regret, and decisions that continued to echo after his death. The distance he maintained in life carried over into how he was remembered by those closest to him. And yet, even that was not the final chapter, because years after his passing, a voice from his past would re-emerge. Someone who had known him during his peak, someone who would speak openly about what she claimed to have witnessed and what she believed had been hidden for decades. That voice belonged to Kim Novak. Kim Novak's shocking accusation. In 2021, Hollywood actress Kim Novak spoke publicly about an experience she said had haunted her for more than 60 years. The timing was deliberate. By then, the #MeToo movement had already reshaped how the public listened to stories that had once been dismissed or buried. Novak said that cultural shift finally gave her the confidence to speak. According to her account, the incident took place in 1958 at a party in Beverly Hills. At the time, Novak was at the height of her fame, fresh off her performance in Vertigo, a role that cemented her as one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. She was young, highly visible, and surrounded by powerful figures in the industry. Novak alleged that during the party, Tony Curtis handed her a drink. She recalled consuming very little alcohol that evening and said that shortly afterward, she lost consciousness. What followed, she said, was a complete gap in memory. She emphasized that she had no recollection of what happened next. When Novak later regained awareness, she said she woke up feeling different. There were no witnesses she could identify, no clear explanation offered at the time, and no immediate path to accountability. In the culture of 1950s Hollywood, she said, asking questions or making accusations felt impossible. Careers depended on silence. Reputation mattered more than truth. For decades, Novak kept the experience to herself. She did not publicly accuse Curtis while he was alive. She did not pursue legal action. She carried the uncertainty privately, describing it later as something she had learned to live around rather than resolve. The decision to speak out came much later, framed by a changing industry and a growing willingness to listen to long-suppressed stories. Novak said the #MeToo movement gave her a sense that she would finally be heard rather than dismissed. Her account was not presented as speculation or rumor, but as a personal recollection of an event she said she never understood and never forgot. The response was immediate. Media outlets, including The Telegraph and The Hollywood Reporter, covered Novak's account, placing it within a broader re-evaluation of Hollywood's golden age. The coverage emphasized not only the allegation itself, but also the environment in which such incidents could occur without consequence. What made Novak's statement especially striking was its timing. Curtis had been dead for more than a decade. There would be no rebuttal from him, no investigation, and no resolution in the traditional sense. The allegation existed entirely in the realm of testimony and legacy. For many, it forced an uncomfortable reassessment. Tony Curtis had long been celebrated as a charismatic icon, a product of an industry that rewarded excess and protected its stars. Novak's account suggested a darker possibility, one that aligned with a growing number of stories about unchecked power in mid-century Hollywood. At the same time, the absence of legal findings or corroborating witnesses meant the story remained unresolved. Supporters of Curtis pointed to that uncertainty. Others argued that the lack of documentation was precisely the point, that silence and imbalance were built into the system. What was no longer possible, however, was ignoring the accusation altogether. Novak's story became one of the oldest allegations associated with the #MeToo era, reaching back into a time often romanticized as glamorous and innocent. It complicated the idea that abuse in Hollywood was a modern revelation. Instead, it suggested a long-standing pattern that had simply gone unnamed. For Novak, speaking out was not about punishment or revenge, it was about acknowledgement. She framed her decision as an act of honesty rather than accusation, saying she no longer wanted to carry the experience alone. What do you think about Kim Novak's accusation? Let us know in the comments section. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss any of our videos. For more interesting content like this, check out the next video on your screen.